call them the Dark Ages. It's a name that conjures up images of endless ignorance, violent superstition, and dim candlelight flickering against the stone walls of crumbling castles. It's a phrase that makes you think of a world without progress, without compassion, without reason. A time when people believed the earth was flat, that demons lived in their soup, and that bathing might actually kill you. But what if the darkness wasn't really about the absence of knowledge? What if the true shadow of the Dark Ages wasn't about what people didn't know, but about what they did, what they believed, and what they accepted as normal? The truth is, this era, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, wasn't just one long, monotonous stretch of backwardness. It was chaotic, messy, full of contradictions. Yes, some knowledge was lost, but other knowledge was suppressed. Some discoveries were made, but hidden. Great minds existed, but they were often silenced by fear, by fire, or by the sword. And beneath the romanticized tapestries of knights and castles lies something far more disturbing. A society where corpses were put on trial, where animals were executed in court, where bleeding someone with leeches was considered cutting-edge medicine. A time when the church could declare you a heretic simply for thinking differently and burn you alive for it. You see, the true horror of the Dark Ages wasn't that people didn't know better. It's that often they believed they did. In this video, we're not here to mock the past. We're here to understand it, its logic, its fears, its power structures, and its strange, haunting beauty. We'll explore 10 unsettling truths about the medieval world that you were probably never taught in school. 10 glimpses into a time that shaped the world we live in now, but that most of us barely understand. So forget what you think you know about the Middle Ages. Let's light a torch and step into the darkness. It sounds like satire, like something from a Monty Python sketch. But in the year 897, the Catholic Church conducted what is now known as the Cadaver Synod, an event so grotesque and surreal that even medieval chroniclers wrote about it with a mixture of disbelief and horror. At the center of this macabre trial was Pope Formosus, a man who had already been dead for over 9 months. His body, rotting and decomposed, was dug up from its grave, dressed in papal robes, and placed upright on a throne in the Lateran Basilica in Rome. Opposite him sat Pope Stephen VI, who had ascended to power in a deeply divided church. And there, under candlelight before bishops and clergy, the corpse of Formosus was put on trial for violating canon law. Stephen VI barked accusations at the lifeless pope, while a deacon was appointed to respond on behalf of the dead man. The charges: performing the duties of a bishop while already having a different see, perjury, and coveting the papacy. Unsurprisingly, the corpse lost the case. It was found guilty, stripped of its vestments, had the 3 fingers used for blessings hacked off, and was tossed into a common grave, only to be dug up again and thrown into the Tiber River. Why? Why desecrate a body like this? It wasn't just madness, it was political theater. The church at the time was consumed by factionalism, power struggles, and revenge. By condemning Formosus even in death, Pope Stephen VI aimed to erase his predecessor's influence, invalidate his ordinations, and send a message to rivals. But this was not an isolated incident. Throughout the Middle Ages, the idea that a corpse could be tried, or that the dead could be punished, was more accepted than you might imagine. Dead nobles were disinterred to be punished posthumously for treason. Skeletons were paraded through towns. Even animals were not immune. Pigs and goats stood trial for murder and theft. Yes, actual court cases, complete with judges, witnesses, and sentences. What this reveals isn't just a society obsessed with justice. It shows a world where symbolism and ritual held supreme power, where even death wasn't a barrier to control, revenge, or political manipulation. In a world ruled by divine judgment and public shame, a rotting corpse could still be used to sway the masses. It wasn't just superstition, it was about who controlled the story. And in the Dark Ages, the one who wrote the verdict wrote history. Imagine standing barefoot in a church courtyard, your hands bound, as a priest blesses a pot of boiling water. You are accused of theft, but there are no witnesses, no evidence, no confession. So instead, you must plunge your hand into the scalding cauldron, retrieve a stone from the bottom, and wait. If your burns healed cleanly in 3 days, you're innocent. If they fester, you're guilty. This was not a scene from a nightmare. This was justice in much of medieval Europe. The concept behind trials by ordeal was simple, terrifying, and deeply spiritual. In the absence of human clarity, God would reveal the truth. If you were innocent, he would protect you. If you were guilty, his judgment would fall upon you, often literally in fire, water, or pain. There were many forms of these trials. Ordeal by hot iron, where the accused had to carry a burning rod across a certain distance. Ordeal by cold water, in which a person was tied and thrown into a river. If they sank, they were innocent but might drown. If they floated, they were guilty and then punished. Ordeal by combat, where the accused had to physically fight their accuser, sometimes to the death. Victory meant divine approval. But perhaps most unsettling of all was how common these rituals became and how seriously they were taken. Entire communities would gather to witness them. Churches blessed the instruments of pain. Clergy officiated like judges. And when the wounds were examined days later, priests made the final call, not on science or medicine, but on God's will as interpreted through bruises and burns. To modern eyes, the system seems absurdly cruel. But in the medieval mindset, it had a certain logic. When life was dominated by the belief that everything, disease, weather, war, was controlled by the divine, it followed that God could also control the outcome of a trial. Yet there was manipulation. Priests could sway results, communities could pressure outcomes. In some cases, the ordeal itself was staged, iron slightly cooled, river depth adjusted, wounds overlooked, depending on who was on trial. Power and faith again danced together in dangerous harmony. In a world without forensic science, without cameras or reliable records, pain became the ultimate lie detector. And for centuries, people truly believed it was God's truth. If you lived in the Middle Ages and fell ill, whether from a fever, a wound, or a mysterious swelling, your first visit would likely be to someone wielding a blade, a leech, or a bowl of pungent herbs. You'd pray for healing, but more often than not, what awaited you was painful, absurd, and sometimes lethal. Medicine in the Dark Ages was a mix of ancient Greek theories, religious superstition, and desperate improvisation. The dominant framework was the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. A person became ill, they believed, when these fluids were out of balance. The solution: restore the balance by any means necessary. That often meant bloodletting. Physicians, monks, and even barbers would slice veins or apply leeches to draw out excess blood, believing this would calm fevers or purge poison. Sometimes they bled patients so much that the cure became the cause of death. For infections or wounds, poultices of crushed worms, cow dung, or moldy bread were common. Some were unintentionally helpful. Moldy bread could contain penicillin, but that was sheer luck. Others caused more harm than good, introducing bacteria and disease directly into open wounds. Then there were the spiritual cures. It wasn't enough to treat the body, the soul had to be purified. Illness was often seen as a punishment from God, a consequence of sin. Patients were told to confess, fast, or go on pilgrimage. Some wore charms, relics, or amulets. Others were exorcised to drive out evil spirits thought to be hiding in their organs. Mental illness, that was demonic possession. And treatments could include chaining, starvation, or even public shaming. Midwives and herbalists, many of them women, offered gentler, more intuitive remedies, using plants like willow bark or lavender. But because they operated outside the church's blessing, they were often viewed with suspicion. Some were branded as witches, others were imprisoned or worse. Perhaps most terrifying was the treatment for the plague or bloody flux, dysentery. Mixtures of vinegar, mercury, or crushed emeralds. The patient was lucky to survive the medicine, let alone the disease. Medieval hospitals were often just extensions of monasteries. They provided shelter, not science. Prayer, not penicillin, and cleanliness, rarely a priority. Surgeons used the same tools from one patient to the next without washing them. Infected wounds were cauterized with red-hot irons. Pain relief was nearly non-existent. In the Dark Ages, to be sick was not just to suffer from your illness. It was to risk everything at the hands of those trying to save you. In today's world, dissecting a body is fundamental to understanding anatomy and advancing medicine. But in the Middle Ages, cutting open the dead was not just taboo. It was a sin against God, a crime that could bring excommunication, even execution. The Church, which held immense power over intellectual life during the medieval period, believed the human body was sacred. To slice it open was to violate the temple of the soul. It was also believed that the body needed to remain intact for resurrection on Judgment Day. If someone's body was mutilated, how could it rise again in perfect form? This meant that for centuries, anatomical dissection was effectively forbidden. Monks, scholars, and physicians had to rely on ancient texts, most notably the work of Galen, a Greek physician who lived over 1,000 years earlier. But there was one problem: Galen had dissected animals, not humans, and humans are not built like pigs or monkeys. Still, medieval doctors trusted his word like scripture. They taught that the human liver had 5 lobes. That blood was made in the liver and consumed by the body, not circulated. That the heart had invisible holes connecting its chambers. All false, but few dared to question him, because to question Galen was to question God's design. There were moments of quiet rebellion. In rare cases, dissections were performed in secret, often on criminals or unclaimed corpses. These were covert, often rushed, and always dangerous. A single whisper could bring inquisitors knocking. In 1300, Pope Boniface VIII reportedly issued a decree, though scholars still debate its exact scope, that banned the mutilation of corpses, especially for transport or burial abroad. Though not strictly a medical ban, it was interpreted widely as forbidding autopsies, dissections, and scientific study of the dead. This chilling silence stunted medical progress for centuries. Without first-hand knowledge of human anatomy, doctors made deadly errors. Surgeries were blind guesses. Treatments were based on diagrams rather than bodies, and diseases that could have been better understood through dissection remained mysteries. It wasn't until the Renaissance, centuries later, that bold figures like Andreas Vesalius began cutting open human bodies and openly challenging centuries of doctrine. He proved Galen wrong on multiple counts, but he did so at enormous personal risk. His work was revolutionary, not just for science, but for shaking the chains of religious fear that had kept the human body closed for so long. In the Dark Ages, ignorance wasn't just common, it was enforced. And nowhere was this more tragically clear than in the forbidden silence of the anatomy table. When you imagine a medieval city, chances are your mind conjures up images of mud-covered streets, overflowing chamber pots, rats scurrying between crumbling stone walls, and the stench of unwashed bodies. And to a degree, that image isn't wrong. But the reasons behind the filth go far beyond mere laziness or lack of knowledge. They reveal a whole different worldview that shaped life in the Dark Ages. To start, hygiene wasn't completely ignored in the Middle Ages. In fact, many medieval people bathed far more than we give them credit for. Public bathhouses existed in cities like London, Paris, and Rome, and were often frequented by both the poor and the wealthy. Some nobles even had private tubs in their homes and perfumed their hair and clothes. So what went wrong? One of the core issues was urban design. Cities were never planned with sanitation in mind. Narrow alleyways became choke points for waste. Most streets weren't paved, and when it rained, they turned into rivers of sludge. Human waste was often dumped into open drains, or worse, simply thrown into the street with a casual shout of "Guard Lou." As warning, what's more disturbing is that many people didn't understand the link between filth and disease. The dominant medical theory of the time was miasma, bad air. It wasn't the bacteria in your drinking water that made you sick, it was the foul smells around you. That meant the focus was on perfumes, incense, and cleansing the air, not cleaning the water. Water, in fact, was a major problem. Wells were often dug too close to cesspits. Rivers were used as open sewers. People drank from the same sources they used to wash clothes or dispose of waste. In times of plague or famine, animals, dead or alive, would be left to rot in the streets. It was a perfect storm for disease, but the problem wasn't simply a lack of cleanliness, it was a lack of infrastructure and political will. Unlike the Romans before them, medieval city governments rarely had the power or organization to build aqueducts, sewage systems, or enforce sanitation laws. Some attempts were made. Paris, for example, issued ordinances against dumping waste into the Seine, but without enforcement, they were mostly ignored. Ironically, as the church gained more control over daily life, public bathhouses began to decline. They were viewed as sinful places, dens of immorality and lust. Some were even shut down during outbreaks of disease, under the mistaken belief that bathing opened the pores and made people more susceptible to illness. So while medieval people may have wanted to stay clean, the very systems that could have supported sanitation, science, infrastructure, and public policy had eroded. The result: cities where garbage piled high, water ran dark, and disease spread like wildfire. Medieval cities weren't filthy because their people were foolish. They were filthy because of a dangerous mix of ignorance, poor planning, and spiritual control, a cocktail that would eventually help fuel one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. We tend to think of medieval peasants as powerless, miserable, barefoot laborers tied to the land, groveling before their lords, ruled by fear, superstition, and the whip. And while much of that hardship was real, it hides a deeper, far more complex truth. Peasants weren't always passive victims. In fact, they could be surprisingly organized, defiant, and even revolutionary. In the popular imagination, medieval society was a strict pyramid. Kings at the top, then nobles, knights, clergy, and way down at the bottom, the peasants. But in reality, peasants made up over 90% of the population, and without them, the entire system would collapse. They weren't just field hands, they were the economic engine of the Middle Ages. Many peasants, especially those known as freemen, weren't as helpless as we assume. They owned land, formed tight-knit village communities, and made decisions collectively. They elected representatives to negotiate with landlords, set local rules, and even administered their own justice. In many regions, customary law held immense weight, meaning peasants could demand rights based on tradition and precedent, not royal favor. Even serfs who were legally bound to the land weren't entirely powerless. They had leverage. If a lord pushed too hard, raised rents unfairly, or ignored local customs, entire villages could resist. They would appeal to higher lords, to the church, or even refuse to work. In England, records show dozens of cases where peasants banded together to sue their lords and won. Then came the uprisings. The 14th and 15th centuries saw a surge of peasant revolts across Europe. One of the most famous was the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England. Fueled by anger over oppressive taxes, economic hardship, and the arrogance of the ruling class, thousands of peasants marched on London under leaders like Wat Tyler. They demanded fair laws, the abolition of serfdom, and the removal of corrupt officials. For a moment, the entire social order seemed on the verge of collapse. Although the revolt was ultimately crushed, it shook the foundations of feudal society. The idea that peasants would rise up armed with nothing but farming tools and fury was terrifying to the elites. And it wasn't an isolated event. France, Germany, Italy, and the Low Countries all experienced similar uprisings, some of them brutally violent. Why don't we learn about this side of peasant life? Perhaps because history has often been written by those at the top, the clergy, the nobles, the literate few. To them, the poor were either saints or sinners, loyal servants or dangerous mobs. The nuances were lost, but the truth is clear. Peasants weren't voiceless. They negotiated, they organized, they resisted. They understood the systems that oppressed them, and they fought back. The image of the peasant as a dirty, broken shell of a human being serves only to flatten the past. The reality is more inspiring and more uncomfortable. Medieval peasants, despite all odds, were agents of change in a rigid world. In the modern world, doomsday cults are seen as fringe, even dangerous. But during the Dark Ages, the belief that the world was about to end wasn't just accepted, it was preached, institutionalized, and weaponized by the most powerful organization in Europe. The Church, from the collapse of Rome in the 5th century to the chaos of the 14th, medieval Europe lived under a constant shadow of apocalypse. Plagues, famines, wars, and comets weren't just misfortunes, they were signs. Warnings from God that the final judgment was near, and no one capitalized on that fear more than the Church. Medieval sermons often painted terrifying images of the end times. Entire towns gathered to hear preachers describe rivers of fire, demons roaming the earth, and Christ returning with a sword. Paintings, stained glass, and illuminated manuscripts depicted vivid scenes of tormented souls, flaming pits, and monstrous beasts straight out of Revelation. For the illiterate majority, these visuals weren't symbolic, they were promises, but this wasn't just about fear for fear's sake. The Church used apocalyptic terror as a tool of control. If you could convince people that their souls and the world itself were hanging by a thread, they'd listen. They'd obey. Pilgrimages, tithes, indulgences, these weren't just acts of faith. They were insurance policies against eternal fire. And when events like the Black Death wiped out half the population, the panic became hysteria. People whipped themselves in public processions, wept in the streets, and burned supposed heretics in the hope that it might delay judgment. But the obsession with the end wasn't just theological, it was political. Popes and monarchs would often cite prophecies or divine signs to justify war. The Crusades themselves were framed as a way to prepare the world for Christ's return. Even natural disasters could be spun as punishment for unbelievers, fueling persecution of Jews, witches, and anyone deemed other. In some cases, entire communities fled their homes, believing the world was ending. Apocalyptic cults formed. Self-declared prophets gained massive followings. One monk in 11th century France convinced thousands that the Antichrist had already been born. Another predicted that Judgment Day would come in the year 1000, a date so widely feared that churches filled to bursting as the millennium approached. Of course, the world didn't end, but that didn't stop the fear. The next plague, the next war, the next eclipse, each was a new sign, a new warning, a new chance to repent or burn. What this reveals is chilling. In the Dark Ages, fear of the end wasn't fringe, it was central. Central to politics. Central to daily life, central to how people understood their suffering and the world around them. And in that fear, the Church found not only faith, but power. When we think of medieval witches, we often picture wild-haired women chanting curses under the moonlight, surrounded by potions, toads, and sinister symbols. But the real fear of witches in the Middle Ages had little to do with actual spellcasting, and everything to do with social control, power, and fear of the unknown. In the early Middle Ages, the official stance of the Church was that magic wasn't real. Anyone who claimed to perform it was either deluded or blasphemous, but not dangerous in the supernatural sense. In fact, the church considered belief in witchcraft a pagan superstition, something to be stamped out. But by the 14th and 15th centuries, that position had changed dramatically. Why? Because Europe was crumbling under waves of crisis, plague, famine, economic collapse, war, and deep spiritual doubt. People needed someone to blame, and as has so often happened throughout history, that blame fell on women. Particularly women who lived alone, were unmarried, outspoken, or had knowledge of herbs and healing. These women often filled vital roles in their communities. They acted as midwives, healers, and caretakers, especially in villages where no doctor or priest was available. But because their power came from tradition, not the church or crown, it was viewed as a threat. And when tragedy struck, a stillbirth, a failed harvest, a mysterious illness, the village didn't ask, "Why did this happen?" They asked, "Who did this to us?" Witch hunts weren't about eradicating magic. They were about restoring order, often patriarchal, often religious, often political. A woman who didn't conform could be labeled a witch. A rival could whisper an accusation, and with that the accused might face torture, public humiliation, and death, often without any real evidence. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, a 15th century witch-hunting manual written by Heinrich Kramer, detailed how to identify and interrogate witches, often relying on sleep deprivation, forced confessions, and twisted logic. It claimed that women were more susceptible to the devil because they were weaker in faith and prone to carnal sin. That book wasn't fringe. It was accepted by the church and widely distributed for over a century. The witch hunts that would reach their peak in the early modern period, like the ones in Salem, had their roots here in the late Middle Ages. But long before mass trials, fear of witches simmered quietly through Europe's darkest decades. A fear not of spells or potions, but of women who dared to live outside the lines. And that fear wasn't just religious, it was societal. Because in a world where death was random, suffering was constant, and authority was absolute, the idea that someone, especially a woman, might have independent power was not magical. It was terrifying. To understand medieval medicine is to enter a world where science, philosophy, religion, and ancient superstition collided. At the center of it all was a theory so influential, it shaped not only how people treated illness, but how they understood emotion, personality, and even morality. The theory of the four humors. This idea wasn't born in the Middle Ages. It came from ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. But it was during the medieval period that this theory became deeply intertwined with everyday life, dominating medical thought for over 1,000 years. According to the theory, your body was governed by four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Each of these humors was linked to specific organs, elements, seasons, and even personality traits. If they were in perfect balance, you were healthy, both physically and mentally. But if one became excessive or deficient, it could lead to sickness, emotional instability, or even sin. Feeling depressed, that was too much black bile. Explosive anger, excess yellow bile. Lethargic and cold, too much phlegm. Overly joyful or manic, too much blood. Doctors of the time didn't diagnose illnesses as infections or viruses, they saw them as imbalances of humors. And the treatments, they ranged from bloodletting and purging to prescribed diets and bizarre regimens based on astrology and weather. What's more disturbing is how these beliefs affected identity and morality. People were labeled as choleric, melancholic, sanguine, or phlegmatic, and these labels weren't just quirks, they were seen as reflections of your inner soul. Being melancholic wasn't just sadness, it was a sign of your spiritual constitution. Being sanguine wasn't just cheerfulness, it could be viewed as indulgence or moral weakness. These assumptions extended beyond the individual. Medieval scholars argued that entire races or regions had certain humoral imbalances. For example, it was claimed that people from hotter climates were naturally more choleric, quick-tempered, while northerners were more phlegmatic, slow, and dull. These theories reinforced early ethnic stereotypes, cloaked in what was considered medical science. Even clergy and scholars debated humoral theory as it related to sin and virtue. Was a lustful person simply morally weak, or were they cursed with too much hot blood? Could a criminal be treated by rebalancing their bile instead of punishing their body? In hindsight, it sounds absurd, but to people of the Middle Ages, it was a comprehensive worldview, a way to explain why we suffer, why we sin, and why we feel. The theory of the four humors gave structure to a chaotic world, but it also ensured that healing often caused more harm, that people were judged by invisible fluids, and that centuries of human suffering were met not with science, but with superstition. In the final part of this video, we'll dive into something even more chilling: the church-sanctioned torture devices that were seen not as cruelty, but as divine justice. When we think of medieval torture, the images that flash before us are grim and grotesque: iron maidens, racks, and red-hot pokers. But what's often forgotten and far more disturbing is the moral and spiritual logic that justified these horrors. In the Middle Ages, torture wasn't just punishment, it was penance, it was redemption, it was salvation through suffering. At the heart of this belief was a chilling idea: pain could purify the soul. Medieval Europe was a deeply religious world, where the church governed not just belief, but behavior, and in many cases, justice. Inquisitors and clerics believed that to save a sinner's soul, you had to first confront their flesh. A heretic wasn't just breaking the law, they were defying God, and that meant the body had to be disciplined, even destroyed, to bring the soul back to righteousness. This belief gave rise to some of the most brutal instruments of suffering ever conceived, each one designed not just to punish, but to reveal truth, extract confessions, or provoke repentance. Take the rack, for example. It wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to stretch the body inch by inch until joints dislocated, while leaving the victim conscious enough to speak. Or the thumbscrew, used to crush the fingers slowly, methodically, until words spilled from a broken mouth. Then there were punishments designed with religious symbolism in mind. The Judas cradle, a pyramid-shaped seat upon which victims were lowered slowly, was intended to mimic the pain of Christ's suffering, a warped reflection of the crucifixion. The heretic's fork, a small metal rod placed between the chin and chest or neck and jaw, prevented the accused from speaking, because speaking was considered the gateway to sin and lies. But it wasn't just about devices. Public torture and execution were theater, performed to teach the masses that deviating from church doctrine would bring not only spiritual doom, but earthly agony. Crowds gathered to witness these displays. Children watched. Priests prayed aloud while bones cracked, and when the condemned finally confessed, whether true or not, it was often taken as proof that the system worked, that God's will had been done. Perhaps most haunting of all was the idea that torture was an act of mercy. If a heretic confessed before death, he might be saved. His soul, though his body burned, might ascend. Thus, torturers weren't villains, they saw themselves as guardians of divine order. The pain they inflicted was framed as necessary, even compassionate. This logic infected everything from secular courts to inquisitorial trials. And it persisted for centuries, until the Enlightenment slowly dragged Europe away from such blood-stained reasoning. What remains today are rusted chains and shattered bones buried beneath centuries of silence. But behind every twisted device was a darker truth, that cruelty is most dangerous when it believes itself righteous. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the Dark Ages, not just in what was done, but in how easily we believed it was right.